Good morning, everybody. Just to welcome our two new guests to the second part of our meeting. We have Heidi Alexandra, the Deputy Mayor for Transport, and we have Michael Liebreich, who is former board member of Transport for London from 2012 through to 2018. This second part of the meeting, we're going to be looking in a bit more detail at the tram and bus safety, and specifically the Croydon tram derailment. So members will remember that on the 9th of November 2016, there was a tram derailment in Sandilands in Croydon, which tragically 7 people lost their lives and 62 people were injured. Michael's been in touch with me as chair and most of you as committee members with some additional information following his time as a Transport for London board member, where he feels that there were some issues that TfL maybe didn't report on enough. And Michael raised a number of issues around accountability, transparency of sharing information, and the RAIB report as well. So we're just going to take this session to delve into some of that in a bit more detail, and I'll start with the questions, please. So to Michael, could you just expand on the issues you've raised with TfL in relation to the Croydon tram crash?
So first of all, let me say that in general, I think that TfL's response has been very good to what's an incredibly tragic situation, a tragic accident. It was one that consumed a lot of the business of the SSHR panel during 2017, quite correctly. So my role, as chair of that panel was probably to get across the detail, quite a lot of the detail, more than most, well, certainly more than most of than all of the other board members. And as I say, I think most of the responses, the operational responses, were very appropriate. But there was this one issue which started to concern us during the middle of 2017, which was the fatigue audit, which was carried out, triggered by a separate incident, but really just the last of a string of incidents in which fatigue appeared to be implicated. And the way that fatigue audit was handled, I think, didn't live up to the standards of the rest of TfL's response. And it caused quite a lot of concern for myself. It raised questions of, well, how was the audit conducted? In terms of, was it robust? Who was involved in that audit? How was what was the interaction with the operation, the part of first group that was being audited? Was that interaction robust? And then how was the resulting audit handled in terms of, there's a whole series of questions that open up, starting around the middle of 2017. It really began and started with the very simple thing of saying, well, there is this fatigue audit, and an executive, and his name's going to come up, I'm sure, Leon Daniels, coming to the SSHR panel and saying that this audit raised no cause for concern. And the flag that raised in my mind was, well, if you have a whole string of fatigue-related or apparently fatigue-related issues, how come there's no cause for concern? And it's very unusual for an audit to raise no cause for concern. And so, I and the other panelists felt that we wanted to see the audit, and it took a long time for us to see it, quite an unusual length of time. And when we did see it, it did raise causes for concern. And we now know that that it was filed as requiring improvement.
What was the time span in terms of before you received that audit?
June, we were told that there was the audit taking place, and the field work was done in June. And at that point, we didn't know what it would say. But I wanted to see a copy of it because it was already raising flags. We then had another meeting in September where we were given an update, but the report had not yet appeared, but it was discussed because fatigue at that point had become quite clearly one of the sort of threads of the investigations. And so the discussion was, well, we need to see it, and it needs to be dealt with appropriately in terms of the investigations that were ongoing at that point, RAIB, ORR, British Transport Police, and the SNC-Lavalin one. When it came to the November 2018 SSHR meeting, we had seen that report, and it was, I believe, pretty shocking. It requires improvement, which is the second worst of the categories that it could have had, although we now learn that that conclusion had been removed from the actual report. And the discussion was, led by myself, clearly we need to publish. And the response, and we'd actually had that discussion, we'd started that discussion in September. The response from management was, no, you can't publish because there's these ongoing inquiries, which I think is entirely appropriate. But the response from myself and the other panel members was, but in that case it has to be sent to the inquiries. It was quite clear, not minuted, which I regret, but quite a clear discussion, which I'm sure all the other board members on that panel will remember, saying, well, it clearly has to be sent. So it was discussed in June. We talked about it again in September and said this is clearly going to be a key piece and it needs to be dealt with appropriately and sent to become part of the inquiries. And then November, it has to be sent. And then it was only in January, after we'd seen the RAIB report, the draft which appeared in December, so the next SSHR meeting, I was very surprised to see that of all the evidence that was cited in that RAIB report, this fatigue audit, which we must remember is probably the best body of information about the fatigue management processes at TOL, the bit of first group that was running the tram, is this detailed piece of work undertaken by professional auditors. It doesn't appear in the RAIB report. And it was only after I asked for confirmation that they had got it that it then became clear that it had not been sent. So then there's followed this kind of whole period of me saying we need to know the reasons and the mayor agreeing. And I think you've got the letter that I wrote to the mayor. I mean, it's very, I've got, that pretty much lays it out. What I said in the board meeting in May 2018, the mayor's response saying that he agreed that the questions were appropriate and they needed to have answers. The way that that got turned into a request for a chronology, which is not an explanation, the chronology that was then published in July, and then this kind of steady stream of FOIs and mayoral questions. Caroline's been asking questions, Keith's been asking questions, and it became absolutely clear that there was no desire and no commitment to deliver transparency on exactly why did this report not get sent in a timely way.
So
and in February, I kind of said, okay, look, I have to step in here. I've committed to the families. I mean, the widow of one of the victims came to an SSHR panel early in 2017, and I committed to doing everything in my power to make sure that the lessons were learned. And so in February of this year, I decided I can't drop it. Even though I'm now no longer on the board, I have to do what I can to make sure that the appropriate transparency is achieved. And of course, since then, we've seen that the audit was changed in discussions with TOL and all sorts of, so I'm getting more and more questions rather than fewer and fewer, and I find that quite disturbing.
Yeah. Just to clarify, though, that the fatigue report was then shared by TfL on the 12th of February 2018.
It was shared, yes. Yes.
Just to clarify that, eventually. Deputy Mayor, is there anything you wanted to add to that, and if you'd like to respond to anything that Michael has raised?
Well, yes, I think I would like to say a few things in response to that. Obviously, my involvement in this dates from me becoming the Deputy Mayor last June, and so I didn't have real-time interaction with the sequence of events that Michael describes in 2017. Some of the things that Michael has said, I agree with. That I understand that he did ask at the November meeting of the SSHR panel for the fatigue audit, which was commissioned following this separate incident. So it wasn't an investigation into Sandylands itself, but was about fatigue management generally, that he asked for that report to be shared with the investigating bodies in November. That wasn't minuted, as Michael has said. I think we'd all agree it should have been minuted. But as a result of that, it wasn't then on the live actions list for TfL officers to be checking off and making sure that they had complied with the actions of that meeting. When Michael quite rightly followed up on this in January again and said, has this fatigue audit been sent? It's my understanding that the then Director of Health and Safety, Jill Collis, said, I believe it has, but let me go back and check. I think in hindsight, it probably would have been better if she'd said, I don't know, because when she went back to check, she discovered that the report hadn't been shared with the investigating authorities. As I understand it, she phoned you immediately at that point, apologised for that and said, we will be sharing the report. That was then done. When Michael asked further questions about the sequence of events, the Mayor at that May board meeting in 2018, which was a couple of weeks before I started in the role, but I was present, not as a board member, to observe proceedings. It was agreed that a report would be circulated to the board, which was published on the 24th of July, setting out a very clear series of events about what has happened and why. As a normal matter of course, when audits are done, TfL wouldn't normally share those audits with investigating bodies automatically. Since this sequence of events, procedures have been strengthened to ensure that if an audit is being conducted which has a material impact and could be of interest to investigating bodies, it is shared as a matter of course. So, you know, I know that Michael and others have called for an independent investigation into this, but having looked at a lot of the documents myself, as you would expect, speaking to senior members of staff at TfL about exactly what has happened, I am confident that a further independent investigation into this is not required. The report of the 24th of July 2018 that is easily available if you put, you know, Tram's fatigue audit into Google, it will be the first thing I can assure you that will come up. And I think Transport for London has been fully transparent about what has happened here. And so that's my understanding of what has gone on.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bacon wanted to comment.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to check a couple of dates. So Michael asked for the fatigue audit to be, well, the committee asked for it to be, they asked the site of it in September. They eventually got it in November. Is that correct? That's what you said?
It was published in September.
Yeah.
So it was published, but it was published just after the SSHR meeting. There's a strange thing happens when you're on the board of TfL, that a lot of quite important reports get published just after board meetings. So we had discussed it in September and all agreed that it was a key piece of evidence that would give insight into and it was just important because, you know, there'd been the Victoria Derbyshire programme, etc., etc. So there was a whole stream of fatigue-related incidents. So we talked about fatigue at every panel meeting, and clearly this was going to be a body of evidence that was absolutely critical for ourselves as SSHR panel, but also for the investigations.
Okay. To run through the other dates, I've scribbled down while you were both speaking. It was in January that you saw the draft RAIB report, and it wasn't until February.
Wait, so there's an immediate RAIB report which came out in November 2016, so straight after the accident. And then it was updated in February 2017. Interestingly enough, the RAIB, those two very early RAIB reports don't mention fatigue at all. So, I mean, there's some odd stuff going on there as well. But
that's where I'm coming to.
The final RAIB report, that I think the first time I saw a full report would have been December, but we didn't manage to have an SSHR meeting because of scheduling, and we didn't, to be honest, we didn't want to have an SSHR meeting around Christmas given that this was the second
Sure.
Christmas that the victims would have not had their family.
I understand. I'm a relative newbie to this committee, so I'm not across the detail quite so much, so bear with me,
Yep.
both of you, please. So the RAIB report didn't have reference to the fatigue report. You picked it up, you approached the RAIB directly and said, have you seen this? And they hadn't.
I didn't approach them directly.
You didn't?
No, because I asked, in the SSHR, I asked management to confirm that it had been sent.
Yeah.
I believe somebody else had already asked them, but there's a whole bunch of, there's a sort of blogosphere that's following this in great detail.
So, the summary of what I've got is that there have been a succession of committee meetings that you, I think, have been chairing.
Yep.
The issue of fatigue had been raised repeatedly. The RAIB report was published and didn't mention it, and they clearly hadn't seen it. The Deputy Mayor, when she was answering the question, said that she gave a reason for that, which is that it hadn't been minuted at the meeting. My understanding, and this is where I'm sketchy on the detail because I wasn't on the committee at the time, is that there were the primary suspicion of the cause of the accident was driver fatigue. It seems to me, therefore, if I'm right about that, that it's absolutely incredible that the fatigue report that had been done would not have been forwarded to the people doing an investigation into this crash simply because it hadn't been minuted at a meeting.
So technically, if you look at the RAIB report, and even when they updated it afterwards, they said that it was very interesting. Although they did not finger fatigue as a cause, they nevertheless made a recommendation for TOL and First Group to improve their fatigue processes.
Number 10, yeah.
However, the SNC-Lavalin report, which was undertaken for TfL, which frankly I think is the better report, says that there are two root cause, sort of two channels, causative channels. One is that the driver lost spatial awareness, and that the other was that the driver was incapacitated, most likely through incapacitated as in fell asleep. So the SNC-Lavalin does say that it's one of two possible causes. And, if I may, there's also, I also want to be able to come back on some of the terminology used about the board briefing. You say, it was an explanation, it is a full explanation. It's not an explanation because, the fact is we've had, the head of HSE who came to this panel in May who said, the story has always been human error, and now we know it's something to do with the minutes. First thing is, all of the action points relating to Sandylands in those minutes, maybe not quite all, but the vast majority were not assigned to anybody from HSE. They were assigned to Leon Daniels. And we need to talk also about, going on in parallel with this, I was raising concerns very privately with the Commissioner about conflict of interest of senior executive in the line management of the Tram being involved in the public relations, in the investigations, in the interaction with the investigating bodies. I didn't think that was appropriate, and I raised it, and it was dismissed out of hand. So that person's getting the action points that we talk about are being rooted, apparently, and we do not know, because we haven't got access to the kind of secretariat notes following that meeting. We don't know who was taking action points and how they were divided up. So the line from that we've had so far has been human error, which is not an explanation. Human error is a categorization. The report on the 24th of July 2018 briefing that purported to explain this didn't actually say which human. And when the head of HSE came here in May to talk about this incident, she said something very interesting. She said, in her, sitting probably in this very chair, she said that the responsibility to send out IA 17780 had fallen between people. Now, I'm sorry, but I think it's really important. It could not be more important to know which people, who was supposed to send it, particularly when there's this background of a board member, and by the way, not just me, other board members. We had a discussion about the propriety of the handling of this potential conflict of interest. And in that situation, not to know which human was going to send it and what the other, who thought who was going to send it. And there was there is in that board briefing note, there's no evidence of any actual investigation. What we found out afterwards was that there were emails, there's an email from another senior executive at TfL asking General Counsel whether he was choreographing the response. I mean, I don't think it's appropriate. I didn't spend all my time on that board going through that process and expect to have responses to me choreographed. I expected them to be investigated and answers given. And I mean, I'm sitting here still, 2 years later, 2 years after raising those concerns, I don't think we got the answers. I got a whole list of questions. I got 20 questions. And the questions, as I say, we seem to be getting more, not less, when we see what happened between drafts of that report.
Chair, some of this is going to be on the section that I'm going to take a bit later on.
Okay.
So for the sake of the integrity of the meeting, I think I'll probably pause at this point.
Thank
Because some of that I think we'll pick up later.
Great, thank you.
Can I just respond to this
Yep.
point that Michael makes about the word choreographing, which he has seen in an email? I think Michael has also seen the response that the General Counsel, Howard Carter, sent to that email. And what this relates to is the discussion that took place between TfL officers, John Fox, Howard Carter as General Counsel, before that report was published for the board, because Michael had emailed and there was a discussion to make sure that comments were addressed in that board report, that would then be cleared within TfL, that report would be shown to me as the Deputy Chair of TfL, which is par for the course with board papers that are published, and that would happen, that sort of administrative sequence of steps would happen prior to that report being published. So nobody should read any form of conspiracy into the use of that word in that email, and I am absolutely categorical and confident in that statement.
I want to just pick up a couple of things on process and this audit report. At the meeting where you first instructed Michael that officers should send this report, the fatigue report, to the various investigating bodies, was the health and safety manager there the person who eventually did send it to them? Was that person sitting in the meeting?
Yeah, I'm just going to check my memory, which is not 100%, but she was, I believe, all of those meetings, quite appropriately. I mean, we were taking this very, very seriously. Yes. So yes, she would have been
Leon
there.
Daniels would have been there as well, and others.
Yes.
So normally at meetings, I don't know how everyone works, but if somebody says, and that report should be sent, you don't just rely on the minutes. Often you make a note yourself. So do you find it surprising that between the Managing Director of Surface Transport, the Health and Safety Manager and others, that no one had made a note that actually they needed to send this report on?
I would be hugely surprised if no note was taken, because the context is also that at the board meeting, but also at every single committee and panel, there are members of the Secretariat that supports the board, and they make copious notes. They sit there and they make notes. Yes. And so... which is also relevant for the point about the word choreography, but that may be an unfortunate word. I would have used managing the process if I if I had been in that situation. But let me, if I might continue, because the issue is not the use of the word. The issue is whether there was any investigation. In other words, the notes of the various participants in that meeting and their subsequent messaging on whatever system is used should have been investigated. That was what was required. Those notes probably still exist unless they've miraculously gone in a shredder. Who knows?
And can I just ask you, as chair of the committee, were you sent draft minutes of meetings to sign off, or was that done by the Secretariat or officers?
Yes, we would. Absolutely. We'd see a draft. It would go to the chair and the deputy chair usually.
So
I'm actually think it would go to. I'm trying to remember because I was either deputy chair or then chair on that committee. I'm trying to think of the other committee I was on the finance committee, whether I always saw draft or whether those were handled by chair and deputy chair.
So you didn't as chair?
But as chair, I absolutely saw.
So you missed you yourself also missed?
Yes.
I'm just thinking when I sit at meetings and I'm chairing, I often note things and check with the team
Yeah.
afterwards when we
But-
write to TfL with a long list that it has picked up.
If I might, it was so extraordinary that this was not sent. It never crossed, how would it cross your mind to check something so basic
But
as
as an
sending this
action,
piece of
yeah.
information? Because we were talking about lots of different
Yeah.
things. There was lots of points of follow-up and so on. And this just didn't seem like, it wasn't like there was a huge fuss made over it. It wasn't contentious. There was nobody saying we shouldn't send it. And so it didn't get
Sort of
minuted. And
slipped
of course,
by.
I hugely
Yeah.
regret
Yeah.
not noticing that, as I regret other things not being correctly minuted that I now notice.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. Heidi, you wanted to come in there?
Well, partly the point I wanted to make is the sort of line of questioning that you've just pursued there, which is that, Michael, it's my understanding that you and the members of the SSHRP would have signed off the minutes from that November meeting, and you did not ask for anything additional to be added on this specific issue. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, and a great regret.
So then the other thing I wanted to ask is, and this is a process thing really for you, Heidi, is how happy are you with the general internal audit process at TfL and how documents from initial drafts to final draft end up being changed significantly? And this is all reminiscent of the Garden Bridge, quite frankly, where we were sent an audit report and then someone actually leaked to our committee earlier drafts which have been more damning. And, we've now, thanks to work of many people, managed to get hold of these internal audit reports and the drafts and the emails. And it absolutely shows that the original one, very strongly here, audit conclusion requires improvement right there on the front. But by the time it was published in March 2018, it had been significantly changed. Safety deficiencies that had been marked as priorities were now opportunities for improvement. TfL agreed to revise the draft after executives at TOL objected. It was too critical and contradicted a verbal assurance they'd been given. I'm not sure whether internal auditors should be giving any assurances to anyone about what would end up in a final report. What are you doing looking at that audit process? Because for us as lay members, that's a serious concern.
So my understanding is that TfL don't agree that that verbal assurance was given. I have gone through both the first version of this fatigue audit report and the final version, as you would expect me to. And, I've gone through every single bullet point in the executive summary to make sure that the issues that are being raised there were to be found in that final version. And I've done a very thorough cross-check. They all are there. So I slightly disagree with your characterisation of this whole process, because substantively the recommendations and the findings of that audit have not been changed. There's been some minor revisions, some reordering, and clearly when an audit is done, it is normal practice for the people conducting the audit to go back to those that they are auditing. The process of improving fatigue management in FIRST, as I understand it, was a continual journey from when Sandylands has happened. I'm not an expert in the world of audit, and the requires improvement categorisation that was in the first compared to the last in terms of those two words. Would it have been better with hindsight for those words to be in there? Then my view is probably yes, but I understand that this was about a dialogue between TfL and First Group about whether they were being audited against industry best practice or what they were contractually required to deliver. The significant thing for me in all of this is the steps that First have taken since all the investigations have been done into Sandylands, since this fatigue audit has been produced, to actually change the performance within trams on safety. And if you look at what they've done, and I know this has been shared with the committee in an earlier session, but I think it is worth saying again, they have
We're going to come on to that later
fatigue,
on, Deputy
okay.
Mayor.
But, there's a lot of steps that First have taken to improve both safety culture and performance, whether that's been reviewing rosters, whether it's been reducing the number of consecutive days that tram drivers can work, whether it's fitting the fatigue detection device in the seats of drivers, whether it's been making sure that all managers at First who are running the trams have been trained in fatigue management. It's my understanding that the ORR have now written to the RAIB and said that they consider that the recommendations that the RAIB made about fatigue have now been implemented. And so I think that we can go over, and I'm happy to speak at great length about these issues, but I do think the important thing here is what steps have been taken to make sure that the tram network is as safe as possible and that never again will a tragedy like Sandilands occur.
And we're not disputing that, and we've been down and did a site visit and heard firsthand some of the excellent work and leading work they're doing now in this area, but clearly at this time there are issues, and I'm just trying to get back to process, and I know that's very dull, but that's so important. What are you doing to review the internal audit process to assure yourself that this is the norm? Because for me, I don't think it is the norm in other organisations that you can, managers, yes, they can change, factually correct, they can't water down, change the narrative in something, water down the narrative around the conclusions of a report. And that's what worried me. That's what happened on the Garden Bridge. In my view, we've seen it here. I accept what you're saying, that the recommendations are saying that the narrative was softened, it was changed. And I feel that's kind of overstepping the mark. And I would like to see you agree to do some work looking at audit and best practice to make sure that TFL are not acting in an inappropriate way.
One of the things that has happened in recent months in terms of the restructuring that has happened in TfL is that the Commissioner, Mike Brown, has appointed a new member of his executive committee as the Chief Health, Safety and Environment Officer. That reports directly to him. Lily Matson is doing that work, and I would be happy to take away from this session and have a discussion with her about reviewing internal audit processes. I have to say, having looked at this and discussed it with officers, I do not, at this current point in time, feel worried or concerned about this. I think there are robust processes, and as I also said earlier, following this sequence of events, when there is a live investigation being conducted by somebody like RAIB or ORR, the processes have changed within TfL now to ensure that the lead investigator actually automatically and proactively, instead of waiting for those investigating bodies to come to us, says, would this have a material impact on any other investigation, and goes to them. So it's not as if nobody has reflected upon what has happened in this process. I think TfL is an organisation that is willing to ask itself some difficult questions, and I think that sits at the heart of a positive safety culture within an organisation. But I would be happy to have that conversation with the new Chief HSE officer and to come back to the committee.
I think it would be helpful to show that you've addressed that particular issue. Both of you, in your views, what do you think are the most significant lessons arising from the RAIB and TfL investigations to improve tram safety going forward?
Can I start by, I will answer that question, but I think that I've got to come back to the audit process. And we've got to look at this. This is 7 months after Sandilands. There's field work for an audit. And the conclusion is, TfL's management of drivers' hours of work and the roster design do not consider fatigue risk factors. This is 7 months after the fatal accident, or reference industry good practice. TfL's fatigue awareness training for managers and supervisors does not include factors that increase fatigue or how to recognise fatigue in others. And TfL has no formal process for determining when a fatigue risk analysis should be carried out or reviewed. This is what they found 7 months after the accident. These became then opportunities for improvement, and apparently there's a discussion about, well, one shouldn't hold them to the sorts of standards that would really deliver safety that are in the ROG 25 standards in the rail industry, because it's not in their contract. And this, you know, so we can hear all this stuff about how, oh, it's much better now. The issue is not, has stuff been done that improves it? It is, what is the transparency? How could it possibly be that a report like that was still the situation 7 months after an accident? Second thing is, how could it be that, I mean, there's a senior executive from TOL says, and he's prepared to put it in an email, he's been given an assurance that it was well controlled. And without any investigation, we're now supposed to believe that that simply didn't happen because nobody has come forward and said that it happened. We do know that there was involvement in an audit, and I was on the board, presumably, to bring, you ask the question, what is normal about an audit process? I'll tell you, what is normal about an audit process is not a line executive responsible for a group or a division that has just had a catastrophic failure of some sort to be involved in an audit. That is not normal, not in financial services, not in industry, right? And we know it happened because everybody's very open about it. Jill Collis, head of HSE, came here and said that, and explained that Leon had been talking about, when he came to my panel and said that there was no cause for concern, that he was talking about interim findings. Why has he got access to interim findings? He's a line executive, he's not in audit. And by the way, HSE is not also, audit is audit. It's like compliance in a bank. Nobody should be involved in that process from the line executives until it comes up to the very senior level and reporting to the board panels. This is a completely not best practice audit approach that has been followed here. It's absolutely clear. And what worries me is, instead of saying, yes, it's clearly not best practice, there's been line executives talking to the press, there's been all sorts of stuff going on, and it's clearly not best practice, and we'll fix it. What we get is, no, I'm convinced, I'm afraid, I'm not convinced that this is...
I absolutely understand where you're coming from, but the Deputy Mayor has agreed to go away and look at this, and it may well be something...
But with a new head of HSE, but it's not an HSE question, it's an audit question, it's an audit and assurance question.
Well, I'm quite happy to ensure that, the General Counsel is involved in this as well. And so I will take that action away from this committee. And if I may just make one further observation on all of this. The RAIB published an updated report in October of last year. So that was subsequent to the fatigue audit that was commissioned in relation to this separate incident being shared with them. And I would just like to read, for the benefit of the committee, what the RAIB said in their updated report in relation to this fatigue audit. They said, the RAIB's review of the TfL audit report identified no evidence of additional factors beyond those already discussed at paragraphs 362 to 382, which was their report. However, the RAB observes that the conclusions of the TfL audit are consistent with its own finding that at the time of the accident, tolls management of fatigue risk was not in line with published industry practice and that there was significant scope for improvement. I think what we also have to remember here is, in addition to that fatigue audit that TfL commissioned after the incident in May 2017, the other investigations that had happened, the RAIB, the SNC-Lavalin report that was commissioned by TfL, there was a lot of exploration of these issues, and the RAIB said subsequent to seeing the fatigue audit report that it didn't bring anything new to their considerations, and I do think that's significant. I'd like to ask your question that you actually asked us,
I'd like us to move on to that, because I'm with you. The audit thing we'll come back to and whatever, I'm sure, but I think there's something there for me, and I'm just thinking, when I used to be on the audit panel of the Metropolitan Police Authority, the unit was absolutely separate, and in fact, the other MPA staff did not have a pass that would let them into it, and police, it was very... And they do the audit process for every other part of the GLA group, apart from TfL. And I wonder whether it might be something you want to look at, because Julie Nosgrove and the team there are experts in this field, and it might be that a shared service might give us more confidence in it. But I'm just throwing that out there.
Okay.
But do you want to answer my question, which was, what are the most significant lessons learned from all of these investigations and the impact they're having now on tram safety?
Well, I think the way I think about this is actually quite similar to the broad concepts that we've set out in the Vision Zero document that we published last year, because as an operator of transport services, you know, to make sure that whether it's the vehicles, the speeds, the behaviours in any form of transport is absolutely critical. And if you look at whether it's RAIB, SNC-Lavalin, the fatigue audit, what's clear when it comes to the tram network is that actually there were some locations where we needed to reduce speed, where we needed better signage, where actually on the design of the tram itself, whether it was the windows or the emergency lighting, or whether it's automatic braking, that actually you have to ensure that the vehicle is as safe as it possibly can be. And that's some learning that we've also taken through to the work that we're doing with the bus safety standard. And again, you know, feeding into that is the safe speeds, around safe behaviour. You know, I heard Jackie Townsend at the previous meeting of this committee talk about a fair and just culture and giving everyone in the organisation the confidence to actually report concerns that they have. You do need to look at the way in which rosters are designed, and not just the overall number of hours that people are working, but sometimes the way in which unusual shift patterns can also contribute to the way that that someone experiences tiredness and fatigue. So I think that I think it's a reminder and a sort of call to action for the transport industry that whether it's about safe vehicles, safe speeds or safe behaviours, you know, that has to be at the forefront of what any public transport authority or organisation you know, needs to be driving forward in.
Thank you. Michael, did you want to add anything?
I take away two things in addition to, I mean, there's a lot of, there's you know, 15 RAIB recommendations and they're all good. I think the two things I would say, and in fact, to be honest, it's just one, is this point, well, it's the point about the just culture, because the solutions will not be technological, and especially when we start to talk about the buses. You know, there was just this long stream of fatigue-related incidents, and you know, on the tram, and yet they didn't reach the top level within TOL. We know that. They certainly didn't reach any level or any meaningful level. They didn't reach the SSHR panel, I can assure you, and they didn't reach the management at TfL, who are commissioning the services. And it turns out that the culture down at the garages and the depots was completely hostile to somebody coming forwards and saying, look, I think we've got a problem here. And so, yes, of course, we have to improve the trams, and we'll talk about the bus safety stand and so on. But you know, you will not ensure safety by having a bunch of very tired drivers and then shining, you know, infrared in their eyes and then disciplining them if they don't behave like machines. These are not machines, they're people, and they have to be treated like people, and it starts with respect. The other part, and I'm not sure if it's related, I think it probably is related, that I take away from this, I'm sorry, it's transparency. You can't have a just culture if you then don't have the transparency. And you know, that I'm still grappling with that, because I've got so many unanswered questions. And the transparency is, of course, there's this whole thing about the, you know, who and which day and so on, and who said. Well, I still love to know who said that there was a clean bill of health and those sorts of things. So there are questions about the transparency, but I think that they go across also. Just it links to the just culture, because it's all about, you know, if you've got drivers who are, you know, hostile, resentful because they're being treated so badly, and yet senior executives are not aware of that even, then that's also a transparency issue. And there's the just culture is how it plays out in the garage, but it also needs to have this communication so that, the idea that the head of safety from TRL would sit here and say there was nothing that raised any alarms at senior level. I've got the quote here somewhere, and I could probably find, here we go, hang on a second. Adrian Jones, he said, I became safety director in 2015, and that was fairly early. There were not any indicators that would certainly come up at group level that would highlight a cultural issue. I mean, that's extraordinary when we now know what was actually going on. And the other thing I want to highlight that was said here a few months back, Jackie Townsend, managing director of Tram operations, said, for anyone who's done any investigation into a just culture, it takes about 3 years to actually embed that into any company. And so we're at the start of that. 3 years, I tell you, we don't have 3 years to fix these very grave safety problems. We can talk about that on the buses and how many people are being killed and injured. And I think that this kind of complacency is completely unacceptable. So we need the just cultures and the transparency front and centre of the solution to this.
It's really helpful, thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bacon. Section 2, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I'll probably start with you, Deputy Mayor. Your assessment on how the tram sector has responded to the RAIB and TfL investigations?
Well, I think if you take it at a number of levels, I think that first, in terms of the operation of the tram in London, I've taken a number of very significant steps to respond to the recommendations, and I won't repeat them, given that I outlined them in response to Assembly Member Pidgeon. One of the recommendations of the RAIB was to set up the Light Rail Safety and Standards Board to provide a comparable body to that which exists for the heavy rail industry. I understand that has got up and running in the last year or so. Transport for London has committed 3 years worth of funding to that. Government had committed funding through until March 2020, and I think there's some indication that they will have committed to further funding, although that hasn't been confirmed. And that's a forum in which tram operators from across the country can basically come together and for best practice to be disseminated. John Fox from TfL sits on that Safety and Standards Board, and I think talking to him, very much sees it as his responsibility to be driving forward the seriousness with which other tram operators take the recommendations from the various investigations. I think when you've lived through a tragedy like Sandilands, you recognise how absolutely imperative it is to be making progress with implementing that whole series of recommendations. And I think I would urge, and I think TfL would urge, tram operators in other parts of the country to heed and quickly the recommendations that have come out of the various investigations, be that around the culture, the roster design, the speeds, signage, fatigue detection devices. Having gone through what the families and victims of that tragedy have gone through, and the organisation TfL have gone through that, it is critical that operators in other parts of the country take heed of that and take action.
Michael, what's your response in terms of how you think the industry
I think
responded?
I would endorse that. I think that the industry as a whole, on the operational level, I think that the improvements, clearly this was a huge wake-up call, not just for TfL, not just for First Group, but across the industry. And I think my bigger concern is actually the learning of the lessons across the surface director at TfL and then out into the bus companies, where I think there's an absolute a huge amount of work still to be done. I would say that the trams are responding, the trams and tram industry responding well, and a lot of people doing a lot of very, very hard work on that. So there's a lot of credit as well. I don't think they've solved the culture problem, and I think there should be more, implementing the just culture And if they're saying, well, we'll give it 3 years before we expect that to be in place, I don't think that's acceptable. But at the operational level, in terms of replacing the windows and the signage and the speed limits and all of those things, I don't have any reason to doubt that they're working hard on that.
Going back some months, I believe you, Michael, were calling for an independent investigation into Transport for London's investigation into this crash. I think that's probably...
Not into the crash, no, the handling of this
Yes,
fatigue
that's what I
report,
meant.
the stuff that we talked about earlier.
So the investigate,
yeah.
It's almost an investigation into the investigation. And my colleague...
Well, it's very specific. It's an investigation into the conduct of that fatigue report, and then into how it was disseminated, and into the way that the conflicts of interest, which to my mind are absolutely manifestly obvious, the way that they were handled is part of that. And I think that's what needs to be investigated. I mean, I would refer you to my letter, which I sent to the Mayor, and I copied you in because I thought it would focus this discussion. It's very specific, I think, about the things that need to be investigated.
That's sort of the nub of my question, because my colleague, Assemblymember Prince, put it to the Mayor, I can't remember, July, about an independent investigation. And you've referenced that in your letter, because there was a GMB union calling for it. I think it was a unanimous motion passed by the Assembly recommending that happen. And the Mayor said he didn't think it would add any value. We've heard from the Deputy Mayor today that she thinks that it would be unnecessary because the RAIB updated report is comprehensive. Do you accept that, or would you still think that that is necessary?
Well, I could list the open questions, and many of them are in my letter, that we don't have answers to. And well, there may be a difference of opinion about whether it's important, whether it's necessary to get those questions, because one point of view might be, well, we're moving on, we're doing all the right things anyway. I don't buy that, because I think it is a symbol of the culture that I'm afraid was prevalent throughout the time I was on the board and deputy chair of the SSA panel as it was before, and then the SSHR panel. I think that it is really important to get to the bottom of those questions. The Mayor has committed to transparency. That's one of the reasons that I was excited to continue to serve my second term on the board. I see every point to independent investigation into exactly those questions that I list in that report.
Okay. Turning to the Deputy Mayor then, obviously Michael is speaking as a former board member of Transport for London who was in situ at the time and was asking questions at the time. He's just repeated his concerns now in a public forum. What is your response? I mean, are you... Because it seems to me, again, I'm approaching this from a layman, there is a lot of grey here, it seems to me, sitting on this side of the table. Wouldn't it be the easiest thing to do, to appoint an independent investigator to clear it up?
I think I've already answered that question earlier in my
Well, you did,
contribution.
but that's why we put it.
Happy to repeat my remarks.
But this is why I've just
about it.
re-put it to Michael Liebreich, because you did earlier on, you said you didn't think it would add any value. And I'm almost none the wiser, really, because there remain, it seems to me, substantial areas that could do with a bit of clearing up.
So my belief in all of this is that I obviously wasn't present during that period of time, but I can assure you that I have spent a significant amount of time talking with TfL officers about this, reviewing documents myself, reviewing email correspondence that Michael has sent, and I am confident that whilst there were mistakes made, the minutes from the November SSHRP meeting should have recorded your request, that actually the report should have been shared with the investigating authorities sooner. That I believe when the mistake became obvious, it was rectified, an apology was made to Michael, an apology was made publicly, and I don't believe, given what the RAIB said in their updated October 2018 report, where they said that fatigue audit, which let's remember was separate from the RAIB investigations and the SNC-Lavalin investigations into Sandilands, this was commissioned following a separate incident, that they have said, having reviewed that report, having been sent it, that it didn't add anything new to the work that they had been doing. In fact, it was consistent with their own investigations when they were looking at fatigue. So at this point in time, you know, having someone go back through what I think has been, you know, some mistakes, which we've held our hands up to and said, we got that wrong and we apologise for that and we've changed our processes. I don't see there is merit in doing an independent investigation into this. What I want the team at TfL to be focused on is learning those lessons, making sure that safety performance on the tram network is exemplary, making sure that the safety performance on the bus network we continue to improve and drive forward and think through everything we can do, you know, to get to the point, whereas, you know, we've set out in our Vision Zero ambition that nobody is killed or seriously injured on London's transport network. Now, if I felt that an independent investigation into the way that the fatigue audit was handled was the best possible use of time, it wouldn't be TfL's time because you'd be commissioning somebody independently, then I wouldn't hesitate to say, if I had concerns about this, I would say, yes, go ahead and do it. But I think I've provided a pretty straightforward explanation about what happened here. I'm not saying everything was dealt with perfectly, because clearly it wasn't, but I don't see the value
it's a
in
slightly
an
lengthy
independent
answer,
investigation.
and that's fine. I'm not trying to cut you off. It seems to me that it doesn't have to be either or, does it? Because, yes, absolutely, we want to make sure there's a crash like this doesn't happen again in the future, and you know, TfL are taking steps on that, and that's fine. It's not really about that so much. It's about the investigation that TfL conducted. There still seems to be, you weren't the deputy mayor at the time, none of this is on you, but a board member of Transport for London who was there at the time, who chaired the safety committee at the time and was asking these questions at the time, still thinks that there are questions that are unanswered. If you are so confident that Transport for London have given you everything and you reviewed everything and it all stacks up, then an independent investigator would probably make that finding too, wouldn't they? And if you are that confident, then what have you got to lose in issuing an independent investigation?
I can go over the reasons again why I don't feel an independent investigation is necessary.
I've heard your
Nothing
reasons. I have heard your reasons, Deputy Mayor, but the point is that a very senior member of the Transport for London board who was there at the time clearly still feels that there are unanswered questions.
And
You
I've
just,
taken,
hang on,
no,
Chair, let me finish my point, please, and then the Deputy Mayor can answer. You don't agree with that, and you've made that point, and we understand that. But wouldn't it be better for Transport for London to clear the smoke away completely? And the only way to do that is for TfL not to mark their own homework and to get an independent investigator to do it.
Well, I hope that I have cleared the smoke away today by giving you a pretty detailed account of what has happened. And I do not believe an independent investigation is necessary for the reasons that I have set out.
Mm. Yeah.
I find it a bit extraordinary, to be honest, the discussion. I mean, I chaired the safety panel. I was on the board for 6 years, right? There was a question about a conflict of interest of a senior executive. Not just, I didn't make this up. This was something that I discussed with the other board members on the panel at the time, and we decided we were very uncomfortable with it. We raised questions about the involvement of Leon Daniels in that audit, right? We now know that the audit wasn't sent. And when you say that, well, it wouldn't have changed anything, the RAIB said that they had all the information, it makes no difference. There is still a police investigation ongoing. We don't know what is useful evidence for them. There's an OR investigation still ongoing. There's a coroner's report still coming. We don't know. It is not up to us to decide what is useful evidence. It is up to us, it was up to me at the time, to make sure that the process was followed. There was a robust provision of cooperation by TfL, and that evidence was provided to the various investigating bodies, if I might, right? And it didn't happen, and we don't know why. Okay. And if you say we know why, if you say it was investigated and you say you know why, then my question is, have you seen any evidence Have you seen the documentation? Have you seen the email traffic between HSE, between the line operation all the way up to Leon Daniels, between those auditors? Have you seen that? Have you ever asked for that? Because there's no evidence in the July 24th note that there was an investigation. We know that there was choreography, but we don't know that there was investigation. And I find that very difficult to say, well, you know, oh, well, it's okay because things are getting safer and they're all good people and so on. I think we owe it to the victims of that accident, and we owe it to the victims of accidents on the buses and on other parts of the network to get to the bottom of exactly how is this organisation run. How does it deal with this sort of situation? What happened? Why did it happen? How did they do that audit? What lessons can we learn about how to do audits? How can we make sure that we're delivering the radical transparency that is the only way to deliver Vision Zero? I can tell you right now, I'm not trying to be difficult or unpleasant or cause problems, but I tell you now, if you do not deal with that culture and if you do not have robust audit processes, you will get nowhere near to Vision Zero. Nowhere near to Vision Zero.
Well, if I may, since Michael has left the board, the TfL has published its Vision Zero action plan. You know, all the evidence that I see from TfL as an organisation at the moment is that safety is its absolute #1 priority. At the beginning of every board meeting, every panel meeting, safety is the first issue that is discussed. All of our investment decisions are taken with safety as the first consideration. Mike Brown has restructured his senior team to ensure that a senior health, safety and environment officer reports directly to him. I see the work of people like Claire Mann, who's the bus operations director, willing to ask themselves some really difficult questions about things such as bus driver fatigue. An organisation that is trying to cover something up would not commission a piece of world-leading research into the experience of fatigue amongst bus drivers. It would not turn around and say that actually we will not let a new bus contract in London unless operators demonstrate that they have a robust fatigue management system in place. They would not put £500,000 into a fund for operators to come forward and say, how do we tackle the issues of fatigue amongst bus drivers? They would not roll out a piece of training for every single bus driver all about the issue of fatigue and well-being and health, the Destination Zero training. They would not have introduced the bus safety standard. And so for Michael to say that there are, problems around the safety culture at TfL, I take, such assertions very, very seriously. But I've got to say to you, I profoundly disagree with you.
I've got quite a few members that have indicated, but just mindful of time, we are running over time. Were there any additional...
in light of what you've just said, Chair, no, I think this is an issue that we are going to have to return to today because I'm not especially comfortable by the exchange that I've just listened to, and I think other members may not be as well, but we need to come back later.
Assembly Member Shah.
Very briefly, Chair. Going forward, Deputy Mayor, TfL awarded a contract in December last year which was about installing a new automatic speed control system. Do you know how it's progressing and is due to be fully up and running by the end of this year? Do you have that information? If not now, can you let the committee have that very vital information, please?
That's correct. The contract has been let, and the most recent reports I've had from TfL officers suggest to me that this will be fully implemented by the end of this year.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Bailey.
Just want to return to this concept of early access by one of the executives' report. How worried are you about what that says about the culture? I don't understand how somebody could see a report before. Why weren't they separated from the audit situation? That's distressing to me.
I missed the very first part of your question.
So I want to return to this concept around early access to the report. So Leon Daniels had early access to the report. Why? I just simply want to know why. Why did he have early access to it?
So I think what you're referring to there is the comments that
Yeah.
Michael
Yeah.
says that Leon Daniels made in June. Is that correct?
Yes.
So he would have been the Director of Surface Transport. I would expect the Director of Surface Transport, who is now Gareth Powell, to be, fully briefed as work is being done on, the progress of the field work for an internal audit, bearing in mind the sort of separation of responsibilities that have been quite rightly set out here. I've met Leon Daniels in my previous career. He has not been an officer of TfL during the period that I have been the Deputy Mayor. And so any questions that you have about why or what he saw back in 2017, I'm afraid you would have to put it to him or somebody else that was in the organisation at the time.
I don't want to make this about Leon Daniels. This has nothing to do with Leon Daniels. But it seems to me that the audit process, just to labour the point, was not separated. And that gives a conflict of interest. And I find that worrying for cultural purposes.
I think we covered that bit already, Sean.
Yeah, no, but for me, we haven't. If we're talking about how well it's gone, and I accept your point, it does sound like lots of progress has been made. I just want to focus on this cultural piece, because the progress is made almost in peacetime. What happens when something goes wrong? Do we refer? How can we guarantee we don't go back to where we were? Because this early access suggests a breakdown in the process at the very least.
I'm quite happy to ask the Commissioner to write to you about the specific questions that you are raising here. As I say, I don't read into it the conspiracy that you do, but given that I wasn't part of the organisation at that point in time, I think it would make sense for me to speak to someone who was operationally responsible for TfL, and we will come back to you and the other members.
Just to be clear, I don't read any conspiracy into it. I just want to understand how the two things, what two things I believe should be separate work.
Thank you, Sean. Assembly Member Prince, Assembly Member McCartney.
Very quickly, I just want to say, Deputy Mayor, that I think you're missing the point about the independent investigation. It's not just about why wasn't it sent to the RAIB. That really isn't the issue. I mean, that's wrong. We need to know why that didn't happen. It's more about, who had access to the field work, who saw it at pre-draft level, who changed the draft report, who removed some significant recommendations from the draft report to the final report. It's really about how the whole thing was handled and why all these changes and things are made. So, we're not arguing about the fact that the outcome may or may not have changed what the RAAB finally recommended, which actually hasn't been made yet. It's just about the whole process. There seems to be lots of flaws, lots of people involved who maybe shouldn't be involved, conflicts of interest. So it's the whole thing we want to look at, because in fairness, the Mayor has said he wants to be the most transparent Mayor that we've ever had. This needs some transparency.
With the greatest respect, Assembly Member Prince, I've answered these questions in this session. If you want to point to me any of the bullet points in the executive summary of version 1 of the fatigue audit that then don't appear in the final version, then I'm happy to have that conversation now, because I've got those reports in front of me and I've been through them line by line myself.
Well, I can tell you, but I don't want to extend this, Chair, because I really appreciate it. The audit conclusion requires improvement was removed entirely. One example, I've given you one. And
so
if you're not aware of that.
If you look at that first report, we've already had this discussion. We've already talked about this issue, and I can repeat what I said to you earlier about that, but I'm not sure that's the best use of time of this committee. What I do know is that those issues that were flagged as priority 1 and 2 issues, which contained about 8 bullet points in the executive summary of version 1 of the fatigue audit, if you look at the final version, which was then produced, those bullet points dealing with things such as, you know, roster design, there's a whole range of different issues there, looking at what the ORR best guidance is. You know, I've actually cross-checked it myself because I wanted to assure myself that there wasn't, that these recommendations and the findings weren't being substantively changed. And having gone through them myself, I feel confident that the process that went on is not one which requires an independent investigation. So whether it's the sharing of the fatigue report or any other aspect of those deliberations, I've set out today why I don't believe an independent investigation is necessary.
Well, I don't want to prolong the agony, I really don't.
Thank you.
Just one comment, and that is, no one's blaming you, Deputy Mayor, you weren't there at the time. You may feel that you're convinced. I'm very sad to tell you that there are many people in this room who remain absolutely unconvinced that this has been dealt with in the right way, and we would still like an independent inquiry. Thank you.
Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you very much. And my question is about the victims and whether or not, whether you think that more needs to be done to support victims injured in incidents involving trams, and particularly survivors and the families affected by the Croydon tram derailment. I'll start with you, Heidi.
So I do think that an awful lot of support has been provided by TfL to both the relatives of the people who so tragically lost their lives in that incident and people who have been injured. I understand that they're, you know, that basically they've been in contact with everyone who has notified them of a claim in respect of injuries. I think it's offered interim payments and support with things such as travel and logistical arrangements where perhaps people need assisted or subsidised travel if they're injured, to help them regain their confidence in the system. I think £6.5 million has already been paid out in compensation, counselling, rehabilitation, to support those whose lives have been so affected by this tragedy. And I do think that the way that the claims process has been handled has been of a very high quality.
Thank you. Mike.
So there was a lot of best practice, I think, a lot of in the aftermath of the tragedy. So as an example, very early acceptance of liability, which enabled payouts immediately to the family. They immediately lost breadwinners. They immediately, so there was the financial piece was dealt with very quickly. There were a lot of things like that that were done very well. And I think that has, I've been off the board now for about a year or so. So my understanding is that that continues. And operationally, the way that they're being dealt with, there are lessons to be learned about how the Sarah Hope line operates and so on. I think those are being taken into account. I have to say, though, I come back to I can't begin to know what it feels like to be the family of one of the victims who lost their lives. But I do think that this is really what's driving me to say I'm not happy and I think we need answers, is because I think that the families need those answers. I mean, you have right now, you have First Group saying things like, following the tragic accident in 2016, the RAIB concluded that the management of fatigue was not a factor. Right? What are you supposed to think when all we know is that one of the two possible explanations for the driver's error, one was disorientation, one was incapacitation, probably through fatigue. What are you supposed to think when you see that drafts of audit reports are changed? And, it's 3 years later. It's 3 years later. So all of the material things, they might be receiving payments and being supported, but on the emotional front of having the closure of knowing what happened, why, and the fact that, as I say, I committed to, in person to the widow of one of the victims, but certainly, across the board, to do everything I could to make sure that they were given the answers, that the process was transparent, and that lessons would be learned not just for the trams, but there are such valuable lessons from this to be learned across the bus system. And those cultural changes, the fact that the board meetings now start with discussion of safety, I battled for, I battled for years for those sorts of changes, and I would use the word battle. The very first thing when I was asked to be deputy chair of the safety sustainability panel, there were two things that I said. Number one, I won't do it unless it's safety, sustainability and access, because at the time no panel, amazing, but no panel had access as its remit, and I thought that was wrong. But the other thing I said was I don't understand why TfL doesn't have a chief safety officer. Energy companies, manufacturing companies, they have chief safety officers. So now that we're getting one, I feel, and that is, I would like the families of the Sandilands victims to think that that was something to do with this cultural change which was spurred by this huge and tragic accident. But I worry about this issue of transparency and the answers to the specific questions about fatigue as it was being managed at the time of the accident, and then, as we now know, even 7 months later.
We're sort of getting to the end of time, so if unless Heidi, you want to respond to anything that you've heard there, Al.
No, I mean, I think, Michael started this session as we're coming to the end by saying that he does think that the TfL response to Sandilands was broadly very well managed, and I think it's good to hear Michael recognise, that actually some of the things, to be totally fair to you, you've been championing in terms of having a chief health safety and environment officer directly accountable and reporting in to the commissioner that's happened, that I, on the basis of my 15 months in the role, the importance that is attached to safety in all of the discussions that I have is absolutely second to none. And so I think you are right to say that the learning from Sandilands has been felt right across the organisation, and I think Mike and his senior team have been committed to making improvements, and we're starting to see those now.
Thank you very much.
Great, no, thank you. Just one thing I wanted to ask, and appreciate that there might be some confidentiality attached to that, Deputy Mayor, just in terms of First Group's contract, which I understand is a 30-year contract with TfL. Just wanted to get a sense in terms of break clause, and if on the back of some of the issues raised, that's something that you think may need to be investigated?
So my understanding of the contract that exists is that it dates back about 20 years, and it was initially sort of established as part of a PFI contract. There were break clauses, as I understand it, for the sort of maintenance part of that contract, and which came in after 15 years. It was Bombardier that previously had been responsible for conducting maintenance on the tram. When that break clause came up, it was decided, because TfL weren't happy with the performance on that contract, to bring that back in-house. And so maintenance now of the tram networks, sits firmly with TfL. My understanding is that there is not a break clause in the contract with regard to the operator. However, what I'm aware of, and I've seen in news coverage recently, is First Group more broadly looking at the nature of their business in the UK, and were first to come to say to us that they didn't want to operate the London tram network in the future, but at that point in time TfL would need to take a decision about how best to provide that service, to ensure a safe network, to provide an excellent service to customers, and to provide the organisation with value for money. And so that's my understanding of the contractual arrangement at the moment.
Right, no, thank you. Just to thank both our guests, thank you for your time this morning, Michael, and to Deputy Mayor. Members, can you note the report and the discussions, please?
Noted.
Thank you. We've just got 2 more items of business. Item number 7, our Transport Committee work programme. Can we all know the work programme, please? The date of our next meeting is Wednesday, the 9th of October, 10 a.m. in the Chamber. And is there any other business from members? No. Thank you. There's no other urgent business. I will close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.